Hey, how's it going? It's Nick here, and you might have noticed that I built a printing press because I hand printed once and I didn't want to do it again. And so I decided to build my own printing press before I would go back to hand printing. I thought I'd string you all along for the design process for this press and how I came to the final design, and I would do a short little tutorial on how you could build your own little plastic printing press. But if you're just here to learn how to put yours together, go ahead and skip to this timestamp here. Now, if the thumbnail didn't give it away, this is not the final version of the printing press. This is. Now, let's talk about what this bad boy can do and some of the design decisions that led to this ultimate form. So, if you're using a 1/4 inch press bed, the throat of this thing can open up to 1 full inch. So it can go down as low as printing some thin little linocuts, or you can even open it up all the way and print yourself some letterpress forms on here. I will say though, you will want some timpin to go with that, otherwise metal type might impress into this top roller. And I knew I wanted some gear reduction to give this thing some real power, and I managed to fit in a 5:1 gear reduction, so this thing has some real power. It looks like a toy, but well, you could probably crush your fingers in this thing. It's pretty powerful. And all of this power could be yours for just a little under 1.3 kilograms of filament. And before anyone asks, I tried to print intaglio with this. I really tried to print some etchings, and it's not quite at that level yet. I'm pretty confident you could probably print some dry points and monotypes and whatnots with it, but full-on etchings and aqua tints, I tried, as you can see here, and this one right here is with non-modified, just kind of like stiffish ink, but if I add a ton of tack reducer to it, I can kind of squeak something out, but like this is kind of the maximum that my press can deliver before I feel like it might break or something. Some future revisions or some modifications, I think it might be able to print etchings, but I haven't gotten that far yet. Now, I really did like this crank wheel, but it was kind of flimsy and it wasn't big enough to give me a really good chunk of leverage, and so I did have to discard that for the crank. Now, I thought it was a really cool idea to integrate the gear's teeth with the bottom roller, and that way, it's a nice, neat, hidden away gearbox system. I could get gear reduction, and there's nothing on the outside. It's a nice, sleek kind of press. But I found that making it bottom driven, it's very hard with a very light press bed. There's just not enough friction between the press bed and the bottom roller, and so it just kind of gets you a little bit, but it doesn't really catch very well. I also experimented with a geared press bed, and that way it wouldn't sort of slip and it'd give it a lot more catch to it, but I found that it took a long time to print this press bed, and it didn't break on me yet, but I just have the sneaking suspicion that it's gonna break someday. I'm not sure. So having a smooth top and bottom roller means that I can make a third-party press bed that's not 3D printed, no special gear is required, and so I can make this out of MDF or wood or even metal if I wanted to. I like the options. And for one pinion and spur gear, I had to make the teeth really small in order to get that gear reduction that I really wanted, and as a result there's only about 1 millimeter of contact between the two, and so I found that under high stresses the tiny little pinion gear would flex, and then once it started flexing, then it wouldn't make contact with the spur gears and you'd be skipping gears, and so it didn't work out, and so I had to scrap this idea and I went with the gearbox. And I know the gearbox isn't as sleek as the original design, but the gears have much wider teeth, and so they have much more catch, and I can get it to deliver a lot more power, so it's well worth the trade-off. Yeah, something that's a huge deal to me, and I know a lot of you won't care about, is I wanted a spring to hold up the top roller. That way my top roller is in the exact position that it's going to be when it prints. Those printing presses that are just suspended by a lock nut, they have a little bit of wiggle up here, and it's going to pop up and off your piece when you kind of make contact, and I really don't like that because sometimes it shifts my artwork. That's a deal breaker for me. I'll talk more about it later. And lastly, I wanted it to look good because I intend this to be something that kind of sits on your desk, and so not only is it a functional piece that you can actually get some printing done with, but it also, it's a fun, good looking little knickknack on it, and so I did tried to make the profile of this look very kind of decorative and kind of reminiscent of like old cast iron things. The inspiration for this project actually came from when I was making the 3D printed brayers. I wanted to kind of torture test and see how durable they were, so I decided to see how much weight this core could take, and this is one of my prototype cores, so it's only like 2 walls thick and like 10% infill, so it's like very weak. And I decided that, you know what, if it could take the weight of a 170-pound man, then, you know, maybe, just maybe, it might be strong enough to print some linocuts with. So I started designing, and it took me a long time. I think I spent about 2 months on this project, just kind of back and forth revisions, trial and error, breaking things and improving things. I think about each part of the press has at least 6 revisions to it. The press half I think has the most. I think it's got like 12 revisions to it. Now let's talk about how we're going to print these. And so I'll throw up the profile on screen right now. And just as a note, I like to print inside to outside because it's a nicer looking print, but it makes the tolerances a little bit worse. And so my tolerances is about 0.25 millimeters, which I know isn't great, but as long as you beat that, you'll be fine. Now go ahead and print off 3 of these pressure knobs. We're gonna use 2 for the press, and the third one's gonna help us attach these to the threaded rods. They'll print pretty straightforward. They're just gonna sit flat like this and easy peasy. Next up is the press body, and so I have mine oriented like this because I actually like the texture of the printing plate, and so I have that the outside facing the bottom. Now I also have these little like pressure markers to let you know how much pressure you're exerting. Make sure your Z offset is really dialed in, because if it's too close, then it's just going to squish all of those out. But on the other side, if you really want to make sure those print nice and crisp and you don't really care about the outside texture, you can just take this model and flip it over, and in either way prints better than the other, and you don't need support for either of them. And go ahead and print off 2 of these. Next up are the top and bottom rollers, and I really like to avoid supports whenever possible, but there was just no going around it for this one. And so you're gonna need supports for this one, and you're gonna print them upright just like this, and you're gonna have that little hex hole at the top. And now really you could print off 2 rollers with hex holes in them. I haven't found that it makes that much of a difference, but I like to have 1 solid roller and 1 hex key roller. And I like to use this zigzag support just because it's super easy to use and it's not a super complex geometry that needs a ton of support. Now I left in the files the geared roller for my prototype if you really want to do it, even though I don't recommend it. But I would say you definitely want to add support blockers to all these little ridges right here between the teeth, otherwise it's going to take forever, and this print's already going to take 33% longer than the non-geared version of this. And you're going to have to spend a whole like 15 plus hours printing a geared press bed, and so in my opinion the geared is not worth it, but I left it in there in case you really want a fully 3D printed press. Next up are these little things, press bed supports. I've been calling them like levelers. They kind of keep the press bed level. Anyway, it's got this weird shape because it kind of keys in between your press bed, but it also leaves room for the gears of the geared press bed in case you ever do that. Anyway, you're gonna print these 1 at a time. Sometimes I've gotten away with printing 2 at a time, but sometimes you get like 90% of the way and then they like knock off and fall over. So print 1 at a time. That's probably your best option. And for the more important thing for this one is you want triangle infill, because if you do cubic infill, then it has a tendency to snap because that infill doesn't go in all the way at its kind of like thinnest part. And so I've broken many of them because I had cubic infill on accident, and so make sure you do triangle infill so you get that support all the way through. Oh yeah, also print it with a brim and print 2 of them. Next up is the gearbox and the gearbox mounting plate. This one's pretty straightforward, and I usually end up printing them at the same time. Next up, we've got this crank pinion gear, and so this gear, actually you want to print it solid, so go ahead and put in 100% infill, because this is what sticks out most of the press, and so if you drop your press, this is what's most likely to snap off, and so you want it to be nice and solid. Oh yeah, also print this one with a brim. Next up are these 2 gears, and you're going to print these with the brims as well, but they don't need to be solid. I haven't had these gears break, so I've just been printing them at like 20% infill, and they've been working just fine. Next up is the crank, and you're just going to print it flat like this, and I usually print the lock pin at the same time. Why not? and it might say that it needs supports, but it prints just fine without supports. And so if you don't have any scrap wood lying around, you can 3D print yourself a base, and so this is gonna kind of, heighten it off the table, and it gives you something you can clamp to the table. Uses a lot of plastic though, it's pretty big. And last up, I have some models for the press bed, but again, this is a massive print, and man, is it gonna max out your 3D printer. So I recommend just buying a piece of wood, but if you really don't want to buy a piece of wood, then there you go. Print it with a brim and take it very slow. And I gotta say, nothing gets you out of bed more than knowing that your printer has downtime. You gotta get out of bed so you can start the next print and minimize that downtime for your printer. Anyway, I have a fast printer, and this took me about maybe like 3 days to print. Now that you got all your parts printed, let's talk about what else you might need. First up, some wood screws if you're going to use a wooden base instead of a 3D printed base. Ignore these pliers, I thought you were going to need them, but turns out you don't. Get yourself a screwdriver that corresponds with your wood screws. Get yourself some lubricant, so here I'm using some 3-in-1 dry lube. You can also use 3-in-1 oil, or some silicone, or WD-40 or whatever. Get yourself some 5/16 inch threaded rod by 3 inches long. For my metric friends, get yourself some 8mm by 100mm threaded rods. And then go ahead and get yourself some corresponding lock nuts. You only need 2 lock nuts. And optional, but I really like them, get yourself some springs, and I'll have a link below to where you can get these springs. I got mine from Menards. You're going to need some super glue. E6000 is good for this. I'm using CA glue, which might be a little bit too fast for this. And then lastly, get yourself a ruler and a little bit of tape. So let's go ahead and start with assembling the pressure knobs, because the glue is going to need some time to dry. So go ahead and pull yourself off just a little bit of tape and grab your threaded rod, and we're going to measure off about 15mm or 3/4 of an inch. And I'm going to put the tape here, and this is going to tell me how far I need to thread my threaded rod into the pressure knob. And then go ahead and drop a little bit of glue into your pressure knob, and then go ahead and take the non-measured off area and put it into your extra pressure knob. And so that's just going to kind of help you get a handle and twist them together. And then take your glued pressure knob, and then you're going to very fast before the glue dries, just kind of twist them together, and that way you can get your pressure knobs onto the threaded rod. And it might seem very complicated and convoluted, but doing it this way avoids crushing the threads. You don't want to use pliers to thread it on here, because if you crush the threads, then you're going to start cutting too much out of the plastic body, and it's going to just like open up a hole and you won't have any threads anymore. So this preserves the threads, and it gives you a nice strong connection. Just trust me on this one, I've made lots of mistakes. So once it's finally been screwed down and you reach that taper mark, you're going to go ahead and let your glue set. So if you're using E6000, you're going to need to give that like a 24 hours. But once it is dry, go ahead and basically get a firm grip on the good side, and then just twist off the extra knob. And I know the hardware stores sell threaded rod with knobs, but they're like $6 each, and threaded rods are never long enough. And so making your own, you get to choose your own color, and I think it's better. Now let's go ahead and assemble the press body. And so you're going to take one of your knobs and your press body, go ahead and grab your lubricant, and go ahead and lube up this hole up on the top here, because you don't want it to have too much friction, and you don't want your threads to cut it too much. You just want to slide it in frictionless. That'll avoid cutting and destroying your threads over time. And so basically you're just going to take this, and you're going to basically, there's no threads in the 3D model, so you're just going to tap your own holes, and it'll get it nice and snug. And tap it until you see the threaded rod come out on the other side. And so you see right there, it has a little slot that it can kind of go into, and this is where you're going to get the lock nuts. And the lock nuts are going to go sit in this little cavity right here, and you're going to have to finagle this lock nut to kind of get it to thread onto that little threaded rod. And it's a little bit tricky because your fingers do not fit in this little cavity, and so good luck with that. Just you'll get it eventually. And then I find when you really want to get it secured onto that lock nut, just jam your screwdriver in there, and that'll prevent the nut from churning, and that'll allow you to get a nice good kind of a churn into it. Once your lock nut is secured to the threaded rod, go ahead and lubricate the rest of your bolts, and that's pretty much all you need. This will suspend your top roller for you and help you set your pressure. Now, I like to add a spring because this little wall bowl right here, I don't know, it irks me how it just kind of pops up onto your press piece. I hate this little bit of wobble right here. I know it doesn't bother other people as much, but I hate it a lot. And so that's why I decided to leave this little cavity at the bottom, which is where you're going to insert the spring. And if you have the spring, you're not really going to need the lock nut, but I still like to put the lock nut on there because it sort of diffuses the pressure from being that sharp tip of the threaded rod. Now let's go ahead and assemble the gearbox. And so we're going to take our lube and we're going to lubricate these kind of circles on the gearbox. I know I didn't get this on camera, but just imagine that I'm putting a drop of lubricant into these circles on both the gearbox cover and the mounting plate. So go ahead and grab your crank gear, and that's going to go into the bottom hole of the gearbox cover with the crank side sticking through. We're going to take our middle gear, which is like the medium sized one, and we're going to take the big gear and it's going to kind of go touch the edge of the gearbox cover. And then lastly, we're going to take our biggest one and it's going to take that circular part and it's going to go push right through, and it should just turn just like that. Now we're going to take our glue and we're going to glue all along the rim of the gearbox cover. Sorry, it's not on screen. And then you're going to go ahead and attach everything and seal it together. And then get your clamp and then just go ahead and let that glue dry. Now for our two rollers, we're going to need to do a little bit of post-processing. The first thing we need to do is to get rid of the Z-seam right here, and so we're just going to go ahead and sand it off. And I'm using some 80 grit sandpaper. 60 or 80 grit sandpaper works really well. And the second thing that we're trying to do is roughen up the entire surface of this drum. That way it has some grab and it can grab your workpiece. Otherwise the PLA is really slick and it doesn't like to grab the press bed or your workpiece. And over time the texture of your drums are gonna go back to smooth just because you're going through so much wear and pressure over time. It's just gonna burnish it down. So every now and then just hit your drums with a little bit of sandpaper to give them a little bit more bite. And then assembling everything is super easy. We're just to take a press half and set it with the inside facing up. Decide if you want your press to be top or bottom driven and put the hex key in that oriented side, and then the non-hex key version in the other side. And then we're going to take our little press bed supports, stick them in these two little outermost circles, ignore the two in the middle right here. I took that out of the final design. And then you're going to take your final press half with the outside facing outwards and then just sandwich it on, and it's about as simple as that. Easy peasy. And I do have a model for a 3D printed base if you don't want to go out and buy and cut a piece of wood, and that's gonna have 4 little pegs that you can align this onto. And be warned that these pegs are a bit of a snug fit and they're really only meant to go on once. You don't really want to take them on and off, so decide if you want it and then you're gonna snap them on. And that should have the perfect spacing for you. And if you're wondering why the bottom is solid, it's so it can act kind of like a basket. And so if you want to throw your felts down here, you can just take your felts, toss them down there, and then just kind of pick up the whole thing at once and take it on the go with you. I thought it was convenient, but yeah, I guess it is a lot of plastic. I like to mount my presses to wood because it's a lot heavier and denser, and so it kind of makes it, a nice bottom weight to it. I also designed this little nameplate that attaches to the side of a 3/4 inch MDF or plywood or whatever you want, and so I'd appreciate if you put it on here. I put a lot of work into this and I'm making it free, and so a little bit of publicity is all that I can really ask for. And it's also the same space as this gap in between, so you can use it as a spacer to help you get your spacing right. But anyway, if you're mounting to wood, basically just kind of get it where you want, sandwich everything as tight as you can, and then you're just gonna put 4 screws into these holes in the bottom, and yeah, that's pretty much it. For the press bed, I decided to go ahead and use this whiteboard that I bought from Menards. I just cut it down to be 6 inches wide and 11 inches long, and I found that's that's a perfect nice mini size, and the whiteboard is super easy to clean. So with the press bed in place, let's go ahead and set our pressure. So I'll teach you how to calibrate the pressure on this thing. So 1/4 turn of these press knobs will move the press bed up and down 1/72nd of an inch. So it's really precise, and we're going to tune it in to be super accurate. And so grab yourself a piece of paper and lower the rollers pretty much all the way down so that they're touching the press bed. And then you're going to grab your piece of paper and you're going to see if you can slide it underneath the roller. And so you can see here that it doesn't quite fit. And so I'm going to keep backing it off until I can slide it under at least one of the sides. And so you can see here through the left side, I cannot slide the paper underneath, but through the right side it does slide, and so that means I need to take the green side up a little bit, and then we're going to try it again, and now it slides underneath both sides. And so just for sanity's sake, we're going to do a quarter turn down and see if they both act the same. And so now it doesn't slide under either, and so that means they're both at the same height and they're pretty tuned within 1/72nd of an inch. And so now that I've got them in place, I'm just going to take a piece of tape and I'm going to put this tape on the knobs just to kind of keep them in the correct orientation. You could also use a Sharpie and just kind of put a little dot to mark, which sides should be on the same. But yeah, this is going to let me know if I'm turning them at the same rate or not. And it's going to make sure that I keep both sides at the same height as the other side. So go ahead and pick a side that you want to mount your gearbox to. And so both sides should be identical. And so I'm just going to use this side, and I'm having mine to be top driven. And so go ahead and grab your super glue, and you're going to put glues across this face right here on the sides, and then glues inside the hole. And you kind of want this to be permanent so it doesn't fall out. I would not recommend swapping it every other day because those pegs will break eventually. And then you're going to glue it and attach it together. And so this one, you want the round side. It's going to match up with the top of this kind of bearing block. And then we're going to take our handle, and it slides on just like that, nice and easy. And then we can take our lock pin, and this is just going to keep the handle from falling off. But of course, it's still removable if you want to take the handle off for transport. Now, if you want to make this a bottom-driven press, you want to take a note that this gearbox only goes in one orientation. Even though the 4 square holes look like they're symmetrical, they're not actually symmetrical. And so when you go to attach it, you actually want your block to go kind of facing out in this direction. If it doesn't fit quite right, then go ahead and flip it around because it doesn't go the other way. It only goes one way. Now, why you might choose bottom driven over top driven? Well, bottom driven, sometimes it helps with shifting in case you find that your paper shifts a lot when you put it down, kind of like a little double drop looking effect. But when your press is bottom driven, sometimes it just doesn't have that same catch that a top driven press might have. So to help illustrate this, I'm going to take my press and I'm going to have it at a bottom driven at the moment. And as you can see here, the press, it's a really tight pressure and it's having trouble just kind of getting my artwork underneath that roller because the kind of bottom roller is pretty smooth and the bottom of my press bed's pretty smooth, and it can't overcome, there's not enough friction for it to kind of catch and bite. Larger, more industrial presses overcome this by having a really heavy press bed, but I just can't have a really heavy press bed unless I get like a piece of steel or something like that, not at this price range. But now if I put it as a top roller, you can see that it easily catches and bite because the friction of the paper and the top roller it has a lot more grab, and so it's a lot easier for this process to kind of get started and then just keep on feeding it through the top roller. But if you don't have enough tympan and the pressure is really tight, sometimes the top roller can kind of shift your top piece of paper and you kind of get this little like shifting effect. But this is only at the extremes of like if you have too much pressure with your top roller. And so I love the size because you can take this with you to events and do some live printing. It's not huge and it's not hassle, and it's really light, but it really packs a punch. Like, I think I could genuinely crush and break my fingers if I tried to with this press. Like, it delivers a lot of power. And if you've seen my YouTube short or my Instagram reel, you notice that the old version, the weaker version, could actually print much wider pieces and still print really nice solid black areas. And so I'm sure this one will have no trouble doing just that. And the reason why I chose that block to test print is because it has big black areas which need a lot of pressure to print, but also really fine lines and that you don't really want to fill in. And it pulled off both of those just perfectly. Now, for the meme, let's see how far we can really push to this press. And as long as the width is less than 6 inches, I don't see why we couldn't have an 8-foot press bed. So I got this piece of wood from Menards. This is the flattest plank I could find, and I'm going to attach 2 36-inch prints to it because I didn't want to buy a roll of linoleum, and so I'm just going to do this in 2 parts, thus creating the 6-foot fish. So let's go ahead and ink it up. Perfect for my 6-inch sprayer. And let me say, this thing took a lot of ink. and it was very cumbersome to handle. And so I decided to take my roll of paper, and I was going to use tape to just kind of hold it at the top. And then I used a second piece of paper on top of that as my kind of tympan felt to minimize shift. And then I'm actually using 2 more presses just as stabilizers, so this press bed doesn't teeter or totter off of the edge of the table. But once it's loaded in, you just gotta crank it on through. And while this was the most cumbersome print to kind of handle, I actually had a ton of fun carving it and printing it. And just kind of like the ridiculousness of, you know, this insanely long print on this tiny little press. But I did it for the meme. And please do forgive me, I forgot to take a pull shot of this in landscape mode. I only did it in portrait mode for the Instagram reel that's about to come. But it looks pretty good. There was that one little weird spot, but maybe the linoleum's just low, or maybe there's a low spot on the wood. And it was hard to try and do a pull for the camera, but that's the best I've got for you. So enjoy this salmon JPEG that I stretched to be 6 foot long. But more importantly, I hope it inspires you not to settle and to have fun with the limited amount of press space that you have, and that anything's possible. So if you want to make one for yourself, I have a link to my printables page that has all the files for this for you to download and to print. And I'm making all of these files free because I think that everybody should be able to enjoy printmaking. And so if you do end up making one for yourself, post it on Instagram and tag me in it. You'll find my Instagram linked down below, because I'm actually really curious to see what you all will make, what fun colorways you'll make it in, and I really want to see what you all can print on these plastic presses. But if you don't have a 3D printer and you live in the US, hit me up on Instagram, or maybe check out my website if I even stock it, and I'll see if I can make you one and send it out to you. Of course, I'd have to charge money for my time and my materials, but I just want to see everyone enjoying printmaking, so I'm going to try and keep it affordable. But again, if I helped you out, maybe leave me a like, it'll help out, and I really hope that you enjoy and start printing. I'll see you later.